At 38, Michael Turner began noticing something uncomfortable. Nothing in his life had collapsed. His job was stable. His bills were paid. From the outside, everything looked normal. But slowly, almost quietly, he started to feel like everyone else was moving forward. And somehow, his own life had stopped moving. The realization started on a quiet Thursday evening. Michael was standing in his apartment kitchen reheating leftover pasta. The television was on in the living room, but he was not really watching it. The glow of the screen filled the room with a dull blue light. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message appeared in the group chat with his college friends. "Just welcomed our third baby today." Michael opened the photo. A smiling couple in a hospital room. A newborn wrapped in a blanket. Two older kids standing beside the bed. He stared at the image for a moment. Then he typed a short message. "Congratulations, man." He set the phone down and stood there quietly in the kitchen, feeling something he could not easily name. The next morning, Michael drove to work like he had done thousands of times before. Traffic moved slowly through downtown Denver. Cars lined up at red lights. Coffee cups sat in cup holders. The city looked exactly the same as it always did. At the office, the weekly operations meeting started at 9. Michael sat at the conference table, reviewing shipment schedules and warehouse reports. Across the room, a younger colleague named Ryan was presenting a proposal to improve delivery efficiency. Ryan spoke clearly and confidently. The leadership team listened carefully. Michael noticed something strange. Ryan had only been at the company for 3 years, yet people were already talking about him as someone with future leadership potential. Michael nodded politely as the meeting continued, but a quiet thought appeared in the back of his mind. When did I become the guy who stayed in the same place? Later that evening, Michael sat on his couch scrolling through social media. Photos from people he used to know appeared one after another. New houses, family vacations, career announcements, promotions. Someone he went to high school with had just opened his own business. Another friend had moved to Austin to lead a startup team. Michael noticed something unsettling. Most of the people he once considered equals now seemed to be entering a new phase of life. Meanwhile, his own life felt strangely unchanged. Same job, same apartment, same routine. He did not feel jealous, but he could not ignore the quiet question forming in his mind. Did I miss something along the way? That night, Michael went for a walk through a small park near his apartment. It was late enough that most people had already gone home. Streetlights cast long shadows across the path. He walked slowly with his hands in his jacket pockets, listening to the distant sound of traffic. For most of his 20s, Michael had focused on one thing: stability, a stable career, a stable relationship, a stable life. For many years, it felt like he was doing everything correctly. He worked hard. He avoided unnecessary risks. He tried to be responsible. But somewhere along the way, stability had quietly turned into something else. Something that felt suspiciously close to stagnation. Back in his apartment later that night, Michael sat at the kitchen table long after midnight. He tried to understand the feeling that had been growing inside him. It was not panic. It was not failure. His life was objectively fine. But the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable a realization became. For years, he had been moving carefully, avoiding mistakes, avoiding chaos, trying to build a life that felt secure. And yet that careful approach had slowly removed something from his life: movement. Over the following months, the feeling did not disappear. If anything, it became clearer. At work, Michael began noticing small things he had previously ignored. New hires were younger and more aggressive. They talked about new technologies, new markets, and new ideas. Michael understood the systems better than anyone in the room, but he also noticed something uncomfortable. The company was beginning to value speed more than experience. In quiet moments, he wondered whether he was slowly becoming replaceable. Not because he was incompetent, but because he had stopped evolving. Evenings were often the hardest. After work, Michael returned to his apartment. The same kitchen, the same furniture, the same quiet routine. Sometimes he cooked dinner. Sometimes he ordered takeout. The television stayed on most nights not because he wanted to watch it, but because silence felt heavier than background noise. Occasionally, he thought about his divorce. Not with anger, just with a quiet sense of distance. Their relationship had slowly faded over the years. Two people living parallel lives, neither of them quite sure how to reconnect. When the marriage ended, it felt less like an explosion and more like a quiet agreement that something had already ended long ago. Still, the aftermath left a strange gap in his life. For years, being a husband had been part of his identity. Now that role was gone, and he had never quite replaced it with something else. Some nights he wondered whether this was simply how life worked for men. You spend your 20s building, your 30s maintaining, and eventually you wake up one day realizing you have been standing still for longer than you noticed. One evening, Michael sat on a bench outside his apartment building, watching people walk past. A father pushing a stroller, a couple arguing quietly while waiting for a rideshare, two teenagers laughing loudly about something on a phone screen. He noticed how easily other people seemed to move through life, or at least how easily it looked from the outside. For most of his life, Michael had believed something simple. A man proves his worth through stability. You get a reliable job. You pay your bills. You show up every day. You take responsibility. For many years, that belief felt solid. But sitting there on the bench, he began to question something. Stability was important, but stability alone did not necessarily create direction. A man could build a stable life that quietly went nowhere. The thought bothered him because it forced him to reconsider the last 10 years of his life. Had he been building something meaningful? Or had he simply been maintaining a structure that no longer served him? The more he thought about it, the more he realized something uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking himself difficult questions. He had chosen comfort over exploration, predictability over growth. And slowly, almost invisibly, his world had become smaller. Maybe the real fear was not failure. Maybe the real fear was something quieter. A man reaching 40 and realizing he had spent years protecting a life he was no longer excited to live. The shift did not happen dramatically. There was no sudden moment of clarity. It started with a quiet decision on a Sunday morning. Michael woke up earlier than usual and went for a long walk before the city had fully woken up. The streets were almost empty. Cold morning air filled his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think about the future without immediately dismissing new possibilities. The thoughts felt uncomfortable. Changing direction at 38 felt risky. Starting over felt uncertain. But ignoring the feeling he had been experiencing for months now seemed even more dangerous. For years, he had believed responsibility meant avoiding instability. Now he began to suspect that responsibility might also require confronting stagnation. Michael did not quit his job. He did not move across the country. He did not attempt to redesign his entire life overnight. Instead, he made smaller changes. He started waking up earlier simply to create space for thinking. He returned to the gym 3 mornings a week. At first, his body felt stiff and unfamiliar with the routine, but gradually the physical effort began to clear his mind. At work, he volunteered for projects that previously would have felt uncomfortable. New systems, new responsibilities. Sometimes he felt inexperienced again, which strangely made him feel more alive. He also began limiting the endless social media scrolling that had quietly become part of his evenings. Less comparison, more attention to his own life. None of these changes were dramatic, but slowly something shifted. His days began to feel slightly more intentional, slightly less automatic. And for the first time in years, he felt a subtle sense of forward motion. Nearly a year later, Michael sat again on the same park bench where he had once questioned his life. The park looked the same. The city sounded the same. But his perspective had changed. He had learned something simple. A man can spend years protecting stability without realizing that life quietly requires movement. Direction does not appear all at once. It emerges slowly through small decisions repeated over time. And sometimes uncertainty is not a sign of failure. Sometimes uncertainty is simply a signal that a man has outgrown the life he built earlier. If you have ever felt that quiet uncertainty in your own life, the feeling that something important has paused without explanation, it may be worth asking a simple question, not whether you have failed, but whether the life you built years ago still reflects the man you are becoming today.